What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Friday, May 24th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have an 11-game MLB slate today. At the moment, very easily could end up being 9 or 10 games. But for now, it's 11. We have Coors Field back. We have the Dodgers in a great hitting park as well. So pretty interesting slate. Having looked at it already a little bit, I think it's going to be really interesting to talk about because at least early in the day, I appear to have a very different opinion on how to play this slate than the field is projected to. So it'll be fun to talk through different approaches and how I see this slate. But first, to plug some other content that I did elsewhere today, there is a new link in the description below for the newsletter at PayDirt. James McCool asked me to send some content over to him for the newsletter this week. I sent him 3 strikeout props, so check those out and sign up for that newsletter in general. Every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, you get plus EV bets, pitching notes, DFS content in general. Check that out from him. The link is in the description below. Now, as always, if you are looking for a specific game as you watch back this video later, you can see where I'm at in the banner up here at the top. And we are going to just dive in with Milwaukee taking on the Red Sox tonight in Fenway Park. So a good hitter's park. 1 pretty good pitcher on the mound, 1 not as good pitcher on the mound. Bryce Wilson taking on Cutter Crawford. Crawford is having a solid season for the Red Sox, but he does have a tough matchup here against Milwaukee. He has struck out about 24% of hitters, just shy of a 4 xFIP. He's 8,900. Doesn't really look like a priority given the matchup and the park. Field's projected to get to about 8%. I got in that ballpark as well. Bryce Wilson on the other side, not getting any ownership. I got a little bit more than the field, but still far from a priority. He is cheap at 6,600, but pretty tough matchup against the Red Sox. Tough park to pitch in, all that stuff. So no real priorities from a pitching standpoint in this game. The Red Sox look interesting offensively. You have Bryce Wilson, who has really struggled with left-handed bats in particular, and you do have some good left-handed hitters on the Red Sox. Fenway Park does not play up left-handed home runs as well as it does right-handed home runs, but a 213 expected ISO and 376 expected WOBA, 2 left-handed hitters allowed by Wilson since the start of last season, sets up pretty nicely for Jarren Duran, Willy Abreu, Rafael Devers. You have Dominic Smith at a very cheap $2,300 price tag. So I do like the lefties from Boston. Obviously, that's not to say that you can't get to like Tyler O'Neill as well, but the lefties set up pretty nicely. On the other side, a little surprised that Milwaukee is showing up as much as they are for me right now. They're not getting any ownership, but you can see here that Bryce Turang, Christian Yelich in particular are showing up for me. Then William Contreras, Joey Ortiz, Jackson Chourio, Willy Adames a little bit less, but over the field on pretty much all of those guys, I don't mind it given the park, but Crawford is a pretty good pitcher. I think that there are better spots to attack on this slate in terms of chances of success, but certainly don't mind getting to Fenway Park at low ownership. I like the Red Sox matchup better, but either offense here certainly gives you upside in this park. Next, we have the Rangers taking on the Twins in a game that I don't think looks overly appealing. Jose Urena on the mound for Texas at 6,100. Bailey Ober is going for the Twins. Ober at 8,300 is having a very strong season. My exposure to him has come up since the first time that I ran stuff today. 26.5% K percentage, 21.7 K minus BB percentage, 3.65 xFIP. Tough matchup against the Rangers, but one thing that did stand out in just looking at the exposures that I'm getting to on this slate, there's not a ton of elite pitching, and the best pitchers are expensive, but there are a lot of just solid mid-range guys on a slate where there's a lot of bats that I want to pay for. So I think you're going to see a lot of pitchers in this 8K range just showing up 10 to 15% of the time. Bailey Ober is one of them, despite the tough matchup with the Rangers. He is a good pitcher, and I don't mind getting him at this price tag. Urena on the other side, not projected for much ownership. Another trend that I'm seeing in the pitching for me is that a lot of these really cheap guys, we just saw it with Bryce Wilson. You see it here with Jose Urena. Right now, they're coming in under-owned for me. That is relatively likely to change as the day goes on because we're going to get confirmed lineups, and it's going to open up hitter value that isn't being projected right now. And as that happens, it's going to make it easier to make cheap stacks and get to better pitching. But right now, what we do know is that I want to get to bats in Coors. I want to get to the Dodgers. The Phillies are expensive. Dodgers are expensive. There's plenty of other, good hitting on the slate as well. So it's making guys like Urena, who are not appealing pitching options at all, look like they're going a little bit under-owned here. Still not showing up in a ton of my lineups at 11%, but he doesn't really give you strikeout upside. He is decent at limiting production. If the slate started right now, I'd probably be getting to him. There's a pretty good chance that by the time we get to lock, he's an afterthought, but that's why he's showing up the way he is right now. Offensively, neither offense is showing up too much at all. It's a tough matchup for Texas against Ober. It's a better matchup for Minnesota against Urania. As I mentioned, doesn't give up tons of power, but a below average pitcher overall. But this park on this slate where you do have a lot of good hitting environments, some weak pitching, it's tough for me to really want to prioritize this one. The field's not really getting there either. Pricing on Minnesota is fine, but nothing, crazy. Edward Julian at 4,500 looks okay, but it's not like that's a really cheap price tag. You have some cheaper pricing, elsewhere in the lineup, but overall, just not a game that I'm particularly interested in offensively. Giants are taking on the Mets in New York, Citi Field, good park for pitching. Christian Scott going for the Mets, Kyle Harrison going for the Giants. Certainly have interest in Christian Scott here at 7,900. He looks good on DraftKings as an SP2 or an SP1. He actually looks good on FanDuel as well, even though you're only rostering one pitcher there. He has good strikeout stuff, 23.9% K percentage through his first 3 major league starts. He projects for similar strikeout numbers going forward. The matchup against the Giants is middle of the road. They are middle of the pack in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. They have a 110 WRC plus on their active roster. Getting Jorge Soler back makes that lineup a bit deeper, but at 7,900 in this park with a pretty low implied run total for the Giants, Christian Scott looks good. Harrison on the other side, not getting any ownership. I'm not really getting there either. He is a fairly highly regarded pitching prospect as well, but he is a bit more expensive than Scott. He is facing the team, with the higher implied run total in the Mets. It's just difficult for me to get to Harrison. This is another game where offensively, I don't expect to get to a ton, but there are a couple individual bats that look decent for the Mets. Mark Vientos as a value play standing out at 2,900. Again, maybe that comes down a little bit by the time we get to lock and we have other value opening up, but 2,900 for him going up against the lefty Harrison looks fine. Pete Alonso showing up a little bit more than the field for me. I'm right around the field on Francisco Lindor at 5%. So the Mets looking like, a secondary stack. When you look at overall exposure, they're showing up in the middle of the pack. 5-mans, they actually get pushed up a little bit to 4th overall. But one thing that really does stand out on this slate is you have the Phillies at the top and you have everybody else basically. So the Mets are kind of just lumped in the middle there. Decent implied run total, not a great park to hit in. I don't love getting to them, but the pricing is fair. Next, we have the Dodgers taking on the Reds. I think the Dodgers are the second best offense, second best stack on this slate. We have Graham Ashcraft taking on James Paxton. Paxton projected for about 5% ownership. That's come down since this morning, and I agree with that. He's been absolutely awful this year. He's still relatively expensive at 8,200 just because of his track record as a good pitcher, but he's not doing anything well this year. 13% strikeout percentage, 13% walk percentage, 5.43 xFIP. There's just nothing that stands out about Paxton you can really point to and say, oh, well, I think he's going to rebound and he's going to get back to that guy that he used to be. We know he's had a lot of injuries and he just kind of seems like he's done. So it is a good strikeout matchup against the Reds, but the park is tough to pitch in. Paxton hasn't done anything redeeming on his own this year. I have a hard time paying that salary for him. Ashcraft on the other side, brutal matchup with the Dodgers. He is 6,400, so he's another pitcher that right now looks a little bit under-owned for me, but by lock, I'd still be pretty surprised if I'm getting to. Offensively, I do like getting to the offenses in general here, specifically the Dodgers. Ashcraft isn't a bad pitcher. He is decent at limiting power. He's decent at limiting runs, 4.03 xFIP this year, only an 18.7% K percentage. His expected ISO to both sides of the plate is respectable, but you're just talking about a Dodgers team that, one, has a ton of good, obviously great hitters in Great American Ballpark, which is a great place to hit. They also do give you some value from a stacking standpoint. Obviously, the guys that you really want to get to in this lineup are very expensive. You can see Mookie at 5,900, Ohtani at 6,600, Smith is above 5K, so is Freeman, so is Teoscar Hernandez. But at the bottom of the order, they're not the best hitters, but they are cheap. Kike Hernandez, 2,900 if he's in the lineup. Gavin Lux, 3K if he's in there. They have Miguel Vargas, who could be in the lineup, who's cheap. So you do get a cheap bat or two that you can mix into your stacks. One other thing that I think is interesting, I don't dive too deep into pitch type data and stuff like that. It's not a big part of my process, but I do find it interesting to look at and talk about. Graham Ashcraft, a big key to him being able to limit left-handed production, being a right-handed pitcher, is his cutter, which is a very effective pitch for him overall. Averages about 96 miles an hour. He's thrown it about 59% of the time to left-handed hitters, both this season and since the start of last season. Only a 135 expected ISO allowed on that pitch since the start of last season. If you look at Shohei Ohtani and Freddie Freeman in particular, since the start of 2022, both of those guys have an expected WOBA north of 400 against right-handed cut fastballs. Now, one reason that I don't dig too deep into pitch type data is that is all right-handed fastballs. So it's not exclusive to guys like Ashcraft that have a good one that they rely on a high percentage of the time. If it were only against like Graham Ashcraft cutters, those numbers probably come down a little bit, but they haven't struggled with that pitch type at all. That is something that I do find interesting in a matchup like this, where you're talking about a pitcher in Ashcraft that is pretty good at limiting power, but doesn't do it by missing bats. You have two of the best left-handed hitters or the two best left-handed hitters in the Dodgers lineup that have just obliterated the pitch that Ashcraft relies on to get lefties out. Makes me like them, a little bit more than I guess I would anyway. But even if you told me that they sucked against that pitch, I would still like them because it's Shohei Ohtani and Freddie Freeman. On the other side, I think the Reds are interesting as well. They're getting a little bit more ownership than, from the field than I'm getting to right now, but very fair prices on these guys against a not very good James Paxton. He's giving it up to right-handed hitters so far this season, which when he was on top of his game, he was very good against righties. This year, a 384 expected WOBA allowed. Tyler Stevenson, only 4K. Jeimer Candelario will be hitting from the right side at 3,800. Jonathan India, 3,400, probably leading off. So you get some value here. The point per dollar projections on those guys are why they're probably projected to be a little bit over-owned. They just show up a lot if you're using an optimizer and not accounting for ownership or range of outcomes. But they certainly look like good values. Happy to get to them if I can. Spencer Steer is more expensive, not getting as much ownership. He's an interesting way to be more contrarian in your red stacks. You can use him. You can use Ellie De La Cruz, who obviously gives you a massive ceiling. Keep in mind, De La Cruz will be batting right-handed against Paxton. He is much, much, much worse from the right side, but it doesn't make him any less fast, and Paxton is still bad. So De La Cruz, again, not getting nearly as much ownership as the cheap guys on the Reds. It is always kind of interesting or kind of appealing when you can stack a team and be contrarian by including their best players like you can here with De La Cruz and Steer, who gives you right-handed power as well. Orioles taking on the White Sox in Chicago. Good chance that this game does not happen, so keep that in mind. Pay attention to the weather as we get closer to lock if this one isn't postponed early. But this game looks like there's a good chance it won't be there. Corbin Burnes is taking on Chris Flexen. If this game goes, Burnes is one of the pitchers that I was referring to that it looks like I'm just taking a very different approach today, at least, at noon, than the field. Burnes is projected for 22% ownership on DraftKings. He only showed up in 7% of the lineups I built. My projection on him is a little bit lower than other spots in the industry, but it's not drastic. It's more a roster construction thing, why I'm not getting to him right now, why I'm not getting to other pay-up pitchers as well. It's a good spot, obviously. The White Sox are a below-average offense, middle of the pack in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. We did get an 11% or an 11 strikeout game from Burnes last time out, so maybe he's made some adjustments, but he hasn't been the same dominating pitcher that he was a couple years ago. He's still been extremely good, though, striking out about 25.5% of hitters, 3.04 xFIP. Very, very good pitcher, good spot, all of that. Not debating any of it. If you are stacking cheaper teams and you have the salary, Corbin Burnes looks really good. Again, assuming this game plays, which I don't think it actually does, but for the sake of this show, if this game plays, Burnes is a good play if you can afford him. I'm just having trouble affording him. Chris Flexen on the other side, same thing we've seen with other cheap pitchers. He's showing up more than the field for me. I don't actually think I'm going to end up playing Chris Flexen today. I sure hope I don't end up playing Chris Flexen today. I have no reason to want to play Chris Flexen today. But, again, it's just kind of highlighting that how much I want to get to expensive bats, I guess. The hitting here is interesting to me if this game were to go, because you are going to have a ton of ownership coming into the Phillies. You're going to have ownership coming into the Dodgers. I think it's warranted. I don't think either of those teams is really going over-owned. If you look at the stacks, they are my top two stacks, both in terms of all stack types and five-mans. But if you're somebody that is concerned about that ownership, maybe you don't like Philly as much, maybe you really buy into Philadelphia first game in Coors, they're going to underwhelm, which, a lot of people buy into it. It does work out a lot. But if you're somebody that just doesn't want to get to those teams, the Orioles have a lot of expensive power against Chris Flexen. So again, this game has major weather concerns, but if it goes, it is interesting getting to very low-owned Orioles against Flexen when, Gunnar at 6,100, it's going to be tough for the field to get to a lot of him if they're playing the Phillies, if they're playing Mookie Betts. But he certainly looks fantastic. Westberg, Rutschman, O'Hearn, Santander, these guys all have power. Mateo has been above average offensively so far this season. We saw him start out last year well also, and then be absolutely awful for the final 6 months of the year. But so far, he's still hitting 109 WRC plus this year. Gives you stolen base upside even if he's not hitting. So from a contrarian standpoint, if this game played, the Orioles do look very interesting. I don't think I personally would be getting to them because of how much I do like Philly in particular. But if you like Philly less than I do, the Orioles are a team that should be kind of moving up your ranks. But again, good chance this game doesn't go, so keep an eye on that. Next, we have the Cubs taking on the Cardinals in St. Louis. This game also has weather concerns. Doesn't look as bad as the White Sox game right now, but definitely something that we will also have to keep an eye on. Shota Imanaga going for the Cubs. Miles Mikolas going for the Cards. Mikolas at 6K, getting 4% ownership, showed up in 11% of the lineups I built. Again, this has nothing really to do with Miles Mikolas. He's not a very good pitcher. He doesn't get a lot of strikeouts. He struck out 17% of hitters this year, 4.11 xFIP. I do think that if I am paying down for one of these SP2s that I don't want, Mikolas is probably my favorite one that I've mentioned so far. I would rather go to Mikolas than Bryce Wilson in Fenway or Urania ever or Chris Flexen ever. So I like Mikolas more than those guys, but still not I would ultimately like to just not be getting to him, but he at least makes a little bit of sense to me given the salary, given that he's not a terrible pitcher overall. The matchup obviously isn't great with the Cubs. Imanaga is interesting to me because he's projected for 7% ownership, showed up in 4% of my lineups. Again, I'm having difficulty getting to these pay-up pitchers because of what I'm prioritizing hitting-wise right now. But if, for just the sake of what I'm about to say, we assume that every game plays today, weather cooperates, Corbin Burnes is good. He's in a good spot. I don't think Corbin Burnes should be 4 times as popular as Imanaga. Imanaga has been fantastic this year. He's outperformed his projections, which you can look at that one of two ways. One, he's likely to regress and end up more in line with his projections. Or two, projections were just selling him short coming over from Japan. And as a result, he's going to continue to be a bit underowned at a price tag that he has earned because industry projections are going to keep expecting him to regress. What we know is that so far this season, he has the highest strikeout percentage on this slate at 27.8%, 3.14 xFIP, the best K-BB percentage on the slate at 23.4%. He has been extremely, extremely good. The 0.84 ERA is absolutely going to regress. But the other numbers, the strikeout percentage, all of that could hold. It's just possible that he was being underprojected. So if you are in a position where you're able to find the salary for the pay-up options, which are Imanaga, Burnes, Zach Gallen, who we haven't gotten to yet, I do think Imanaga is really interesting in tournaments just because he's getting so much less ownership than the other two guys. And as far as I can tell, as far as I'm concerned, they are the same. They have the same range of outcomes. They're very similar plays. You can certainly argue that Imanaga's matchup is the most difficult, going up against the Cards instead of the White Sox or the Marlins. But the implied run totals are very similar. The pitchers themselves are very similar. So if you are able to pay up and if weather does cooperate, I do think that Imanaga is an interesting ownership pivot off of the two more popular guys. Offensively, if you're not getting to Miles Mikolas like a sane person, the Cubs do make some sense. They're not getting much ownership. They're not showing up a ton for me, but reasonable price tags on Christopher Morel, Suzuki, Dansby Swanson, still really cheap. Nico Horner, reasonably priced. Bellinger, sub 5K. This is an offense where if you were going to take the approach and say, well, I'm going to play the best pitchers and pay down for offenses, again, you would need the weather to cooperate since two of the best pitchers are in games that might not play. But if weather cooperates and if that were your approach, you do get power upside at pretty reasonable price tags from this team. That's just not the approach that it seems like I am very likely to take, at least right now, 7 hours before the slate starts. Next, we have the game that I fully expect to get a lot of. Phillies taking on the Rockies in Colorado. Christopher Sanchez on the mound for the Phillies. Ty Blach on the mound for the Rockies. Zero interest whatsoever in Ty Blach. Christopher Sanchez is pulling some ownership, showing up about 15% of the time for the field, about 11% of the time for me. I get it. Maybe going a little bit overowned, but looks like a good value here at 7,200. The Rockies are one of the worst offenses in baseball. Obviously, pitching in Coors Field is scary, but this is a $7,200 pitcher that has a 3.1 xFIP this year, 22.2% K percentage. So a very respectable strikeout percentage. He's good at preventing runs, and he's only 7,200 on a slate where I want to pay for bats. Sanchez looks like a good SP2 option here on DraftKings. Offensively, the spot doesn't really get much better for Philadelphia. Ty Block's not a good pitcher. He doesn't miss bats. He gives up a lot of production to righties. He's better against lefties, as you would expect. But Bryce Harper, Kyle Schwarber, I don't care really who they're facing. Lefty, righty, whatever, they're going to look good. But also on top of Ty Block, keep in mind, this Colorado bullpen has had to work recently. They played an 11-inning game in Oakland yesterday afternoon where they used 6 relievers. They used 4 relievers the day before that. This bullpen's a little bit worn down. You have a pitcher in Block that, is pretty likely to not go deep into this game. There's a lot of add-on run potential for Philly once they get into this bullpen as well. Very high implied run total, highest on the slate by a wide margin. The only thing kind of working against them is that they are expensive. At least the guys that you would really want to get to are expensive. But I kind of like that in tournaments. Yes, it's pushing me to some pitchers that I don't feel comfortable getting to. But on an 11-game slate, I can't sit here and nail down which sub 7K pitcher is going to have a good game. But there are so many of them. There's a pretty good chance that a couple of those guys just give you solid outings today. And if you hit on the right ones, it puts you in a position where you can get these Philly stacks. So Real Muto looks great at 5,400. Harper looks very good. I'm getting a lot more than the field. Rojas, if he's in the lineup, isn't an exciting hitter, but he's cheap enough that it opens up some of this other salary. Castellanos is reasonably priced against a lefty that doesn't miss bats. Alec Boehm is really expensive. Kyle Schwarber is really expensive. Stott's expensive, but I don't mind getting to any of those guys. Stott is probably my least favorite guy on Philly because he's the only lefty that isn't named Bryce Harper or Kyle Schwarber. He is expensive, but he did get MPE on DraftKings with second base and shortstop eligibility, and he's projected to be the lowest owned guy on the team. So that gives you reason to play him as well. Love getting to the Phillies, especially at their projected ownership right now. They are going to be the highest owned team on the slate, but you can see that I don't really think they're going over-owned. I think that they are correctly owned, if not a little bit under-owned, when you compare their chances of success to their ownership. And then also keep in mind that one trend we've seen this season and going back to last season is that when we've gotten really obvious top stacks like the Phillies, the field has had a tendency to kind of over-adjust. And the actual ownership on that top stack ends up coming in lower than projected because a higher percentage of people playing DFS these days are using ownership heavily in their process. And we just see it a lot where there's a clear gap between the number 1 stack and the number 2 stack, and they end up even in ownership percentage because such a high percentage of the field just pivots to that number 2 stack and drives up their ownership while pulling down the Phillies. I wouldn't be surprised if you see the Dodgers ownership come in a little bit higher than projected, the Phillies come in a little bit lower than projected. So I really, really like getting to them. It's just a matter of, can you stomach the cheap pitching that it requires? Colorado on the other side, they're in Coors Field and they are more reasonably priced. They do also negatively correlate with about a 15% owned pitcher. So they have that working for them. Sanchez very good at limiting power to both sides of the plate. So I don't think there's really a case to be made for this hitter looks really good in this matchup because I do think Sanchez is good. It's more so you can just get to the Rockies at low ownership and cheap price tags in Coors Field. And that's, not a bad place to be. Rogers, Doyle, Tovar, Diaz, Diaz has gotten really expensive. So Rogers, Doyle, Beck, Tovar, the guys that I'd probably be getting to the most if I were to go to the Rockies. Next, we have the Guardians taking on the Angels in LA. One of the more popular pitchers going in this one, and one of the pitchers that I think is going under-owned, also going in this one. Patrick Sandoval, 7,700, taking on Logan Allen. Sandoval is projected for about 21% ownership. He's projected to be one of the most popular mid-range pitchers, and I don't have any issue with that whatsoever. If you subscribe to my Dub Club betting package, I did bet the under 5.5 strikeouts at plus money this morning. That is now minus money. It's moved in our favor, but that doesn't really have a lot to do with DFS. 7,700 is a good price tag for Sandoval. It's not a great strikeout matchup against the Guardians, but Sandoval is a good pitcher overall. 23.6% K percentage this year is up several points from last season, but it's in line with what he's done for pretty much every other season in his career. So I'm not looking at it like, oh, it's got to come back down to earth. It's probably just kind of what he is. 3.68 xFIP, just good overall pitcher. Again, not a great strikeout spot. Tough park to pitch in overall, but this park is also good for strikeouts. 8% above league average over the last 3 seasons in strikeout park factor. So you do have that working in Sandoval's favor, even though the matchup itself isn't good. I just really like this price tag on Sandoval. On the other side for Allen, only projected for about 5% ownership here, showed up in 14 to 15% of the lineups that I built. 19.5% K percentage this year, 4.17 xFIP. Certainly not having as good a season as Sandoval, but gives you a similar range of outcomes. You can see over here, I have him projected about 3 points behind Sandoval. So that's why you're getting more ownership to Sandoval. But I think Sandoval should be like 1.5 times, maybe 2 times as popular as Allen, not 3 to 4 times. So Allen is interesting to me. I don't know if scary is even the right word against the Angels, but they do have right-handed bats that can do damage against the lefty. Joe Adell has seemingly made significant improvements at the plate. He's a right-handed bat that can do damage, but it's not even about like thinking what the most likely outcome is. It's just that I want pitchers in this price range so I can afford the Phillies, I can afford the Dodgers, I can afford some other expensive bats, and Logan Allen is a reasonably talented pitcher against an offense that overall you don't expect to be that good without Mike Trout. They are better against left-handed pitching, again, but the upside when you think about what your lineups can look like with a 5% owned Logan Allen and the bats you can get to is just really appealing to me. It helps to mitigate some of that Phillies ownership as well. So, he's going to get hit hard sometimes, and this park is tough for pitching in, but I just don't think he's getting enough ownership right now. Offensively, the Guardians and Angels, neither one showing up a ton. Jose Ramirez at 6K, another expensive bat that if you're getting there, great. Not a good matchup against Sandoval, but it is a good park to hit in. I do think if you're going to go the opposite approach and pay for pitching and pay down for stacks, there is a case to be made for the Angels in this park, just looking at their salaries. Ohapi sub 4K, Rengifo with MPE, Pilar is cheap, Joe Adell, still cheap at 3,700. I think there's a case to be made for the Angels. They're not showing up for me, as you can see. But again, that's because of the roster construction that I'm prioritizing. If you wanted to go a different route, the Angels do start to make some sense there, but probably not a spot that I would get to very often, at least right now. Before we move over to the Yankees and the Padres, quick plug for my Dub Club stuff. I mentioned the sports betting thing a minute ago, but I do offer MLB DFS content along with betting content through Dub Club. The links are in the description below. As far as the MLB content goes, you get access to the projections I use, my top stacks, top pitchers, top hitters, all that stuff. Access to my Discord where I hang out throughout the day talking strategy, talking the slate, talking DFS in general. You get access to all of that stuff. It's regularly $25 a month. Use the link in the description below. 20% off your first month. Knocks that price down a bit. If you want to add on the betting package, it ends up being $40 a month regular price. Again, 20% off with the link below. So check those out if you're interested. Again, you get access to all the data and stuff that I use to make my lineups, and you get to talk strategy with me, talk strategy with everyone else in Discord. So check that out if you're interested. Links in the description below. Next, we have the Yankees taking on the Padres. Carlos Rodon going for the Yankees. Yu Darvish going for the Padres. Darvish is getting ownership at 8K. And this one's kind of weird to me where he's not showing up a lot. I'm surprised he's not showing up more just because of the emphasis that I'm putting on pitchers in the 8K range. I don't think he should be getting this much more ownership than other pitchers around him. He's fine, but the matchup against the Yankees sucks. The park is good, but again, the matchup against the Yankees sucks. And Darvish he's good. 25% K percentage, 3.54 xFIP. He's underpriced based on his talent level, but you're talking about a Yankees team that against right-handed pitching this season, not only are they one of the best offenses in terms of production, 128 WRC plus is actually the best. They're edging out the Dodgers and Oakland, who clearly don't actually belong in that sentence, but 128 WRC plus against right-handed pitching. The Padres are the best at 129. Yankees are second at 128. They also have a bottom 5 strikeout percentage at 19.4%. I've said it a bunch of times recently, but this isn't the same Yankees team that would hit a bunch of home runs and strike out a bunch. from a few years ago. This team hits a bunch of home runs, and when they make outs, they are just like hitting flyouts. So it's not to say that Darvish doesn't have upside at 8K, but this is a brutal matchup, even from a strikeout standpoint. Carlos Rodon on the other side, 9,200. I really wish he were still in that 8K range because I would like to get to him here, but the price tag has adjusted. I talked about it the last time he pitched. I don't remember if it was a show day or not, but I definitely talked about it in Discord. He has made adjustments in what he is throwing, and they have gotten him back closer to what he was pre-injury. Not to say that he is the elite, Cy Young winner that he was a few years ago, but if you look at his numbers overall this season and since last year, they're mediocre at best. 23.5% K percentage, 4.32 xFIP overall this season. Over his last handful of starts, I'm going to try and pull it up quickly here so we can see it on FanGraphs, but over his last handful of starts, he's cut back on his cutter usage. He's added his slider back in, and his slider is a pitch that gets a lot of swings and misses. His cutter is a pitch that does not. So you can see it over here going back to the Milwaukee start 5 starts ago. Starts throwing his slider, 27%, 43%, 36, 28, 27%. He had thrown it less than 20% in 4 of his first 5 starts, but he's throwing that pitch more. He's cut back on the cutter. If we look at the results of his pitch types this season against right-handed hitters in particular, slider 257 expected WOBA, cutter 555 expected WOBA, 20% swinging strike percentage on the slider, 8% on the cutter. If you go back to last season, 267 expected WOBA on the slider. He wasn't really throwing the cutter at all, but again, it was getting lit up, wasn't getting swinging strikes. So he's changed his pitch mix. It's resulted in increased strikeouts over that period as well. This goes back to his start on April 27th was when he made this change. So in those 5 starts, 28 1/3 innings pitched, 27.7% K percentage, only walking 2.5% of hitters, 3.55 xFIP. Again, he's been much better as a result of these changes. The problem is he's $9,200 and he's facing a Padres team that is very difficult to strike out. Their active roster against left-handed pitching since last season, 18.4% K percentage, 108 WRC plus. So that was basically just a really, really, really long-winded way of me saying that I found a bunch of really cool stuff on Carlos Rodon. I think he's much better going forward than he has been to date, but he's still really difficult to play today because of his price tag and matchup. Offensively, 2 good offenses here. I think it's difficult to get to much of either one, but they, given the park and given their difficult matchups, but they certainly are both on the list of teams where if you, in larger field tournaments especially, are just saying, look, I get it, the Phillies are in a good spot, but I refuse to play them. I'm not playing the Dodgers because they're too obvious too. Anytime you can just play like 1% owned Yankees and Padres in large field stuff, you're not necessarily wrong, but again, the park is not good for hitting home runs. The matchups are tough. You're purely betting on talent here if you wanted to go that route. Next, you have the Marlins taking on the Diamondbacks. Zach Gallen on the mound for Arizona. Braxton Garrett is going for the Marlins. I'm getting the Garrett at 5,800. I really don't mind it at that price tag. He's a better pitcher than 5,800. No real doubt about that. The matchup isn't ideal against Arizona, but only 2 starts this season, 9 2/3 innings pitched, striking out 27% of hitters. Projects for like a 21 to 23% strikeout percentage going forward, which is just better than a $5,800 pitcher. In his career overall, 23.5% strikeout percentage. In his most recent start against the Mets, he went 4 1/3. He went 5 1/3 in his first one, so we shouldn't be overly concerned about workload or anything like that. It's just effectiveness that we're concerned about because of the difficult matchup. Arizona against left-handed pitching since the start of last season, their active roster has the second lowest strikeout percentage at 18%. They have a 124 WRC plus. This is a brutal matchup for Braxton Garrett, but again, he's 5,800. I want to get to expensive bats today. He's not getting any ownership is the big thing as well. Like if you were to tell me that, 15% of the field is playing Braxton Garrett in this spot, I would probably, say, yeah, I'll play the Diamondbacks bats instead against him. But if nobody's going to go to him, I don't mind rolling the dice. Again, we've seen that I'm getting to some really, really ugly names right now just because they're cheap. Garrett at least has some semblance of talent. Overall, against right-handed hitters since the start of last season. He does have a 23.4% K percentage, 337 expected WOBA allowed. Does give up some power with a 183 expected ISO. But again, this isn't, I don't think the most likely outcome here is that Braxton Garrett pitches well. But when Braxton Garrett does pitch well and you have him at 2% owned, you have really, really, really high upside lineups. And I do think that he pitches well often enough for him to be worth considering at this ownership. Zach Gallen, obviously the pitcher that most people are going to be more interested in, getting 16% ownership, only showed up in 6% of the lineups I built. Again, I think that number comes up as we get closer to lock, as confirmed lineups come out and hitter value emerges. There's also the potential that ownership comes up a lot. If you lose Corbin Burns, that ownership's coming up. If you lose Burns and Imanaga, that ownership is really coming up. Imanaga obviously not getting a ton of ownership anyway, but Burns is. And so probably, if the weather doesn't cooperate, Gallen's ownership comes up. How much I get to him comes up probably as a result of the weather and also cheap hitters showing up in confirmed lineups. But right now, just because of the roster construction approach I'm taking, not getting to as much Gallen as the field. But again, it's a good matchup, 10-3. He's a very good pitcher. Overall this season, striking out 26.8% of hitters, 3.22 xFIP. If you are able to afford him, Gallen looks very good. I'm just having trouble affording him. Offensively, Arizona is showing up middle of the pack as far as stacks go. 5-mans, they get pushed down a little bit, but it looks like a team that, using 2-mans and 3-mans, probably a pretty solid approach. Randall Grichuk's getting quite a bit of ownership at 3,200. Looks like a value play that people are going to use to get to guys like Zach Gallen, which does make him probably a little bit overowned. And also you run into the issue of your lineups looking very similar to other lineups that have that build. That's probably another issue for me right now, because hitter pricing with the current projected lineups is pretty tight, especially on the hitters that I want to get to. And so you get guys like Randall Grichuk that are clear values, but everybody that needs a cheap $3,200 outfielder is going to get there. And so you run into the issue too of okay, how am I differentiating within these lineups if I'm going to pay up pitchers? So that's probably another reason why right now I would be using different roster constructions than the field. But again, that'll change by lock as we get lineups. Ketel Marte, Corbin Carroll, these guys all look fine. Jake Berger, 3,500. Interesting play against Gallen if you wanted to negatively correlate. Not getting any ownership, but he is 3,500. He does have power. If you need a cheap hitter and you don't want to play one of these 10 to 15% owned guys, Jake Berger does give that to you. So overall, not super excited in the offenses here, but Arizona would be the side that I want to get to first. Then finally, we are wrapping things up with Houston taking on Oakland. In Oakland, Houston is favored as you would expect. Justin Verlander on the mound for the Astros. Ross Stripling going for the A's. Verlander, 8,600, pulling about 23% ownership. Showed up in about 15% of the lineups that I built. Verlander is really weird this season. He's only struck out 18.7% of hitters, 10.1% walk percentage, 5.22 xFIP. That stuff is all terrible. I don't know what to make of it, though, because for one, you have obviously a very strong track record for Justin Verlander over 2 decades of pitching. But even recently, in recent seasons, he's been a good pitcher. He is still, he hasn't just fallen off of a cliff, at least yet. But the other thing is that while his strikeout percentage is down, K-minus BB percentage is down, everything looks bad as far as his results go. His stuff this year is graded out better than previous seasons. Even in the last 30 days is what I have highlighted here in this table. His stuff plus over the last 30 days is the best of any pitcher pitching today. So we've seen enough of Verlander this year that you should be paying attention to his strikeout percentage and his K-minus BB percentage and very concerned by what has happened. But his track record combined with the fact that his stuff still grades out very well makes me think that there's still a good chance he rebounds and his stuff gets better. And then now you have him facing the A's, who are one of the best strikeout matchups you can get in Oakland, which is a good park to pitch in, on a slate where I want mid-range pitching because of the bats I'm trying to get to. And a lot of the pitchers that would be interesting are in tough matchups, like Bailey Ober against the Rangers, for example. I don't mind getting to Verlander here at this price and just hoping for the best. I do think he's going a little bit over-owned. Again, I think that the range of outcomes for Verlander is similar to some lower-owned pitchers around him in salary, but he does look like one of the more likely mid-range pitchers to succeed given the matchup against Oakland. Again, they have hit really well this year. I mentioned it a second ago. 121 WRC plus against right-handed pitching is 4th best behind the Padres, the Yankees, and the Dodgers. that probably comes down to earth, but they do have power in their lineup, but they also strike out a lot. Stripling on the other side, showing up in some lineups just because he's cheap. I think you can pretty much ignore him against the Astros. Really brutal matchup there. Houston, from a stacking standpoint, is showing up right behind the Phillies and Dodgers for me. I probably shouldn't say right behind because they're clearly very far behind the Phillies in terms of percentages, but in terms of just, like ordinal numbers, they are third. Park isn't good, but other than that, the matchup is good. The hitters are obviously very good. Stripling doesn't miss a lot of bats. The Astros have tons of power. Since the start of last season, 173 expected ISO to lefties for Stripling, 192 to righties. This year, he's actually been really good against lefties. Sub 300 expected WOBA, sub 100 expected ISO. I have a hard time thinking that continues. And even if you tell me it does continue, I don't really care too much when you're talking about Yordan Alvarez and Kyle Tucker because they are freaks that are not your normal left-handed hitters. The righties, Pena, Altuve, have plenty of power. Bregman at 4,400 looks fine. So the Astros are another team where they're not getting nearly as much ownership as the Phillies. They are a perfectly fine pivot if you want to get away from the Phillies. They're not as likely to succeed, but again, they're not getting nearly as much ownership. So Astros look good. Oakland on the other side doesn't look as good. They're a team that I do get to a good amount. They got me second place on the main slate yesterday, which was nice thanks to that 11-inning game. But the main case for Oakland would be that Verlander has given up like 1.6 home runs per 9 innings so far this season. Right-handed hitters have a 231 expected ISO against them so far. Lefties are at 142. If you go back to last season, still a 186 expected ISO to righties. So, you're talking about this pitcher that has struggled, is 20 to 25% owned. You have a $3,800 Shea Langoliers at catcher with power. You have Brent Rooker at 4,400 with a lot of power. Seth Brown's only 2,500. Lefty, he's a lefty, and they haven't hit Verlander as well, but he's just really cheap. But Langoliers and Rooker in particular, I think, are pretty interesting. Very low-owned ways to negatively correlate with Verlander, even if you didn't want a full stack Oakland, which seems like a little bit of overkill in this park on a 9 to 11 game slate. Phillies with like Shea Langoliers at catcher instead of JT Realmuto to save money makes you contrarian, gives you a ton of upside still. Doing something like that makes a lot of sense to me. So that is 11 games, all 11 games on the slate. Again, keep an eye on the Chicago game and the St. Louis game for weather. To recap, I view pitching entirely differently today than the field right now. I do think there's a chance that looks different by the time we get closer to lock and we have lineups coming out. Patrick Sandoval, Justin Verlander look like two of my favorite pitchers, two of the field's favorite pitchers. I like Logan Allen as a contrarian pitcher. I like Christian Scott as a mid-range guy. Then I start getting to more contrarian guys, Braxton Garrett in particular. The field and me both happy to get to Bailey Ober, happy to get to Christopher Sanchez. The field is going to be getting to more Corbin Burns, more Yu Darvish, more Zach Gallen. Burns, again, could get wiped out, which would just turn into more Gallen probably. I would like to get to Gallen. I just don't know if I can find the salary. I'm not finding it right now. Offensively, Phillies look great. I don't have any real issue with their ownership. I think that they are correctly owned, if not under-owned. So I would like to still be getting there. Dodgers and Houston look good. I like both sides of the Boston-Milwaukee game. Rockies as a contrarian stack in cores makes sense to me as well. Home run pick. I will go with trying to not go to cores because that's really obvious. I'll go with Langoliers against Justin Verlander in Oakland. Going a bit off the board there. Again, I really like Langoliers as a contrarian play at catcher tonight in DFS. So that's all I have for you on this show. Thanks for checking it out. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. Use the link below to sign up for my MLB DFS content if you're interested in that. Other than that, thanks for checking out the content. See you on Monday. Have a good weekend. Good luck on your lineups.